Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breakfast Club. This is episode, I think, 23. But more importantly, it is the first in a 3-episode mini-series that we are doing for Oceans Week. And it's not really Oceans Week, but this content was originally scheduled for around June 8th. And that was really when people, thousands and thousands of people in cities across the country and even the world were starting to protest in the first wave of protests for the Black Lives Matter movement. And we obviously felt like that wasn't the right time for us to talk about oceans. They are, however, incredibly important and a huge part of what the Academy itself does. So when we moved the content to later in the month, we decided to expand it. So this is the first of 3 panels that you will get this week. And we are so pleased to welcome for this Dr. Rebecca Albright from the California Academy of Sciences, who Breakfast Club viewers have seen before. A very special guest, Dr. David Oburo from Cordio, East Africa, who we are so pleased to have with us, and we appreciate you braving that time difference for this event and for the test prior. And Dr. Luis Rocha, also from the California Academy of Sciences, who Breakfast Club viewers are likewise familiar with. And today we are going to be talking reefs. And we're going to swing right into action because we've got mini talks from all of these amazing experts today. But before I hand it over to Rebecca to kick it off, I will remind viewers that you can ask questions at any time, and we really hope you do, just by leaving them in the comment section of Facebook or the chat box on YouTube. And with that, I'm going to let you all say hello, first of all. So hello, David. Hello, Luis. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Lauren.
Hello.
Hi. Sorry, I was like, you're only allowed to smile for these first few minutes. But I will hand it over to Rebecca. So David and Louise will say goodbye to you for the moment, and I will move you from these screens. We'll take just a moment. And Rebecca, I will give you your slides. And thank you so much for getting us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Laurel. Hi, everybody. Happy Oceans Week. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really happy to be able to be here and chat with you about ocean and reef conservation. And I hope you're all safe and well at home amidst these chaotic times. So most of you are probably familiar if you've been watching some of the Breakfast Club talks over the last couple of months about the plight of coral reefs right now, that they're experiencing unprecedented rates of decline, mostly associated with climate change and rising levels of coral bleaching worldwide. And so what I wanted to focus on today is really some of the more solutions-focused research that's happening. In particular, I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that the Academy is supporting through its Hope for Reefs initiative to try to give us some hope around this current crisis, and to just talk about some of the innovative and creative ways that people are trying in the scientific community to address the current crisis at hand. So it would be remiss of me if I didn't start out by just kind of talking about how incredible these ecosystems are and why they're worthy of being saved to begin with. So what you see here is a coral colony, and we call it a colony because it's actually hundreds to thousands to millions of little tiny coral polyps that are all living in association with one another in a clonal organism that we call a colony. So this particular coral is a species called Ceratopora hystrix, or the bird's nest coral. And every single one of these little white circles is one individual coral polyp. So this coral colony is thousands to millions of coral polyps that are all communicating with one another. They're sharing food, they're sharing resources for the overall benefit of that entire coral colony. And this coral colony started its life as one tiny little, or several tiny little, coral larvae that were swimming around in the ocean. And then at some point, that little coral larva that's the size of about a sesame seed decided to swim down and adhere or fix itself to the ocean floor. And it metamorphosed into what looks like a tiny little flower or one single coral polyp like this. So this individual is about 24 hours old. And after about 1 to 2 days, that coral will start to secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton, which you can see here underneath the transparent tissue. You see that intricate calcium carbonate skeleton that the coral's secreting for a support structure, much like you have a skeletal system that supports your overall tissues and organs. Over the course of weeks, that individual coral polyp, the first one, will start to asexually bud new mouths around the outer ring of the coral. So this one has 5 new mouths and that first mouth in the center there. And then it'll start to take up a symbiotic alga that it acquires from the surrounding environment and incorporate it into its tissue. And that alga actually photosynthesizes and translocates carbon to the animal and gives it, in some cases, up to 90% of its food requirements. So that's a really fascinating evolutionary symbiotic relationship that's involved that is obligatory to the existence of coral reefs. And it's the breakdown of that relationship that is coral bleaching that we'll talk about in a little bit. So over the course of months, that coral starts to continue to asexually bud and grow. And then over the course of years, it'll grow up into a coral colony that we saw previously. And then fast forward decades, and you have hundreds of thousands of coral colonies of different species that actually create a community on a reef. And over geologic timescales, these systems can actually build up to structures that you can see from outer space that are thousands of kilometers long, like the Great Barrier Reef. And so the fact that this structures this massive that have persisted for this long started life as tiny little sesame-sized larvae that were swimming around in the ocean is something that just continues to wow and amaze me, and is why I am still a coral reef biologist to this day. So unfortunately, these systems are experiencing unprecedented rates of loss. It's been estimated that we've lost about 50% of corals over the last 30 years. And we're looking at losing anywhere from 90 to 99% of corals by the middle of this century over the next 30 years. And this is mostly due to increased frequency and severity of coral bleaching events. So this right here is a heat map from the third ever global mass bleaching event that we've had. It started in 2014 and went through 2017. And what you can see is how widespread and pervasive that event is. So that event affected over 70% of reefs worldwide, and it was only the third global event that we've ever had. And then just a few months ago, the Great Barrier Reef started bleaching again, and this was the third bleaching event that it's had in the last 5 years. So one of the things that's really concerning right now is the frequency that these events are happening. As we just talked about, coral reefs are really slow growing ecosystems. It can take a reef about 10 to 20 years to recover after an acute disturbance like that. And it's currently estimated that these events are happening every 6 years. So obviously, if you have a system that's perturbed every 6 years and it needs 10 years to recovery, it's never getting any sort of meaningful breathing room to actually recover from that disturbance. And that's what's really disturbing. So what this has triggered is kind of a renewed sense of urgency, which has prompted a renewed sense of innovation and creativity in the scientific community about how we can try to help reefs, how we can give them some more breathing room and buy them some time while we work as a global society to address some of these larger issues like climate change and ocean acidification. And so there's a wide range of solutions that are being explored right now, everything from actually manipulating the coral colony at a genome level to try to create super corals or thermally tolerant corals that will actually be more resistant to bleaching. There's scaling reef restoration efforts, which is something I'm going to talk about today. And then everything from land-based breeding to cryopreservation, all sorts of different things are kind of on the table right now. So reef restoration is a practice that's been around for about 30 years, and it's a practice that borrows techniques from silviculture and land-based reforestation techniques. And so the primary way that this is done is by growing corals in either a land-based or an ocean-based nursery, breaking branches off and then continuing to propagate them, and then eventually taking those corals and planting them back out onto the reef. And we're really good at doing this right now at small scales. So we are very effective as a community at restoring coral reef structure at about the scale of a hectare. But when you're losing corals at thousands to tens of thousands kilometers on such a scale and a fast time-paced event, then we actually need to be doing this at much larger scales. So a couple of projects that I'm going to talk about today are efforts that the Academy has been involved in over the last few years to try to scale global restoration efforts. One of the reasons why this is such a locally effective technique is, at the end of the day, what these techniques rely on is an individual diver or teams of divers that go out and individually plant corals to the reef. And what that looks like is securing via epoxy or cement an individual coral like you see in this picture onto the reef. And you can imagine that that's a very time and labor intensive process. So one of the projects that we've been supporting is a scientist by the name of Dr. Taryn Foster out of Australia. And she's worked on a project called Coral Maker. And this is a collaboration between Fulbright, the Academy, and Autodesk to incorporate robotics and automation into this process to remove the human labor component. And so what her project is doing is 3D printing, pre-printing skeletons for the coral so that it doesn't have to take years to a decade for the coral to actually build the underlying skeletal structure. So you 3D print that skeleton and just give it the skeleton at the beginning, just from the get-go. And then the holes that you see here have been developed with robotics in mind, so that you could actually use robots and automation to take coral fragments and plug them into this. And then you would actually get, over the course of months, weeks to months, those fragments would then resheet and grow tissue over the underlying structure. And you could, in the time span of months, get corals that were large enough to outplant back out onto the reef at meaningful scales, as opposed to taking years for that process to come into play. So that's one really exciting project. So stay tuned. Right now it's a year in, and Taryn has developed prototypes of these, and the next phase is really testing them. So we're going to be deploying them in the Steinhardt Aquarium at the Academy. We're going to be deploying them at different field-based locations to actually test these in the wild, which is really exciting. Another exciting partnership is one that we have with SEACOR International. So SEACOR stands for Sexual Coral Reproduction. And SEACOR is a restoration-focused group that goes out during annual mass spawning events to actually collect gametes of corals in the wild. So they collect eggs and sperm, take them back into the lab and rear coral larvae like we saw, settle those larvae, and then once they grow out into little baby coral colonies like you see here, plant them back out onto the reef. But again, this is dependent on that human labor component of physically putting the coral onto the reef. So one of the projects that we've been supporting in collaboration with Autodesk and SEACOR and the Nature Conservancy is printing self-stabilizing structures so that you don't actually have to physically epoxy something onto the reef, but that you might be able to scatter them around with corals that are already on them, and they're self-stabilizing so they don't move. And they've tested this so that most of these prototypes move fewer than 50 centimeters over the course of 6 months, which gives the coral enough time to grow and actually adhere itself onto the reef. And the idea here is that you would take thousands of these, grow them, would condition them in the wild, settle coral larvae onto them, and then eventually scatter them around, again, removing that that labor component. And you would get baby corals that would then, you can see on the right here that this coral has actually adhered itself and grown out to actually be part of the reef community. So that's another project that, please stay tuned to that. That's being tested worldwide now at least 4 or 5 different locations in both the Caribbean and the Indo-Pacific on a variety of different species. And the last project that I want to talk about is a project that I'm leading at the Academy called the Coral Spawning Lab. And the Coral Spawning Lab is an effort in collaboration with Steinhardt Aquarium to develop predictable protocols for spawning corals in a land-based setting. And this is with conservation breeding in mind. Like you might imagine conservation breeding techniques that have been developed in land-based aquaria or zoo for a variety of different imperiled or endangered organisms. And we're now looking at doing this for corals. So corals typically spawn, which is their one time a year reproductive event, sexual reproductive event. Most corals do this once a year, usually in late summer after a full moon after sunset. So there's a variety of different environmental cues that we think trigger this one time a year annual event. But the four things that we think that are really, really important are seasonal temperature cycles. So they have to experience a summer and a winter. Lunar cycles, they have to experience new moons and full moons. Solar irradiance, incident light levels, they have to experience sunrises and sunsets, and then solar insolation over the course of the year. So what we've done over the last few years is program these different parameters into a kind of new aquarium system that we're running at Steinhardt to try to trigger and elicit coral spawning in the lab. We plug in, we program, like you can see here, sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset, the day of the new moon every year, monthly mean temperatures over the course of the year. And then on a weekly basis, we're changing the solar insolation to try to mimic this hierarchy of environmental cues that has to occur in order to elicit it. And I want to show a really quick, a 1-minute video to show the construction of this lab. So this was a lab that had to be shut off from any other light pollution. So we had to build kind of a photography dark room. And then we collected coral colonies from Palau. And we shipped the colonies over 30-hour flight back to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. You can see our team offloading them here. And then using that program in order to simulate lunar cycles and sunrises and sunsets, we were actually able to elicit our 3rd annual coral spawning event this year. So what you see here is the coral spawning in our aquaria at the Academy, which is really exciting. And this year was actually the first year that we had respawning. So what I mean by that is that last year's corals that were collected in February spawned in April of last year, and then they underwent the entire cycle of generating eggs and sperm in our system, and then they spawned again. Those same coral colonies spawned again this year, just a couple of months ago, in our system at the same time as the wild populations, which is really exciting. And we're only one of a few places in the world that's able to do this work right now. So here we have coral babies that are about a year. They're now about 1.5 years old, which is really exciting. And this year, because of COVID, we were able to do some really fun and exciting outreach events. So this is me showing a coral spawning event and doing a live stream, all masked up during COVID, and sharing with everybody that wanted to sign on worldwide this coral spawning event as it actually happened. And that's something we hope to keep doing year after year because there was such a positive response from that. So I'm going to end there today, but I do hope that, you've been hearing a lot of bad news in over a lot of different fronts right now, but with respect to coral reefs, you've been hearing a lot of bad news. And I want to leave you with a little bit of hope in terms of some of the solutions focused efforts that we are really trying to push forward in order to make a meaningful difference at scale. So thanks very much, and looking forward to the other talks and some fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. We people loved hearing about all those possible solutions or partway solutions. And I thought I would just ask you, I'm trying to save most of the questions for the end for those asking, but we got a lot of good ones for you. But one nice one, just as a kind of grounding, like foundational type thing, was Tamer asked when you were talking about just how many coral reefs we're losing, she asked, how long do healthy coral live?
That's a great question. And there's not actually a very direct answer for you because they're colonial. It's a bit tricky. But we do know that some of the boulder species that you might see, like the brain corals, you can get coral colonies. There's one in America Samoa that's very famous called Big Mama. And we think that coral colony is almost 500 years old.
Oh, wow.
And we know that because you can take a core of it and they secrete growth rings, much like a tree secretes growth rings, and you can actually age that colony. Some of the more branching corals, it's hard because parts of it might break off and that one might keep going and this one died. And is that a new coral or not. So some species it's a bit debatable, but the ones that are clear cut, like the boulders, can be hundreds of years old.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring David Obura to the stream. Welcome, Dr. Obura. And Rebecca, we'll say goodbye to you for now. We'll see you at the end for some more of those questions. And yes, welcome to the screen again. And I will add your slides, just a moment. There they are. Okay, thank you so much again for being here, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. So, hi everybody. Thanks for joining this session. I'm in my evening time over here. It's 8:30 at night. I'm in Kenya in East Africa, which I've shown you on the map here. And I'm going to take a bit of a change of pace, a change of scale from what Rebecca has presented, and show you a little bit of what's happening with coral reefs here in East Africa, or the western side of the Indian Ocean in that circle, and the consequences for people over here dependent on reefs. But also think about some of the things that we're trying to do to raise awareness and get more action and commitments on saving coral reefs from governments, from companies, and from business and so on. Because as Rebecca mentions, corals really are at a crisis stage right now in terms of many different pressures. So I'll give you a quick round of the West Indian Ocean, a little bit on the diversity of corals and the threats and pressures that we're facing here and globally. And then I'll touch on some of these solutions, quote unquote, because they're really about trying to get more information out and really try and get more coherent action around the world all at once. So I'll just try and advance my slides. Okay. So the Western Indian Ocean. So this is a part of the world that isn't so familiar to many people in terms of its origins and so on. I will try and tell you a little bit. There we go. Ocean basins really develop around the movement of continents around them. And when I started to look at the biodiversity of corals and reefs in the West Indian Ocean, you know, we always thought that the wide open part of the ocean must be the oldest and the smaller parts must be the newest. But it turns out, and this is very interesting, that this map up in the left shows you the color of the ocean floor. And you can see blue is very old and red is very young. So you can see the mid-ocean spreading ridge where the ocean floor is created. And these ridges stretch all the way down the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean as well. But the oldest part of the ocean here is really the East African coasts and between East Africa and Madagascar. The two separated about 180 million years ago. And then the other thing that's really important for coral reefs, ecosystems in our part of the world, is that there was so this volcanic hotspot, which right now is in the island of Reunion. I think if I get a pointer here, you can see that. That's Reunion Island, and that's an active volcano right now. But 67 million years ago, that started off, India was over that hotspot. And this is the volcanic eruptions that created what's called the Deccan Traps in India. It's also what led the dinosaurs to go extinct with the tectonic activity all that time ago. And then as India moved northwards, this whole string of oceanic islands and shallow banks set up, leading to where we are now. So these two things have been very important for the Indian Ocean corals. And then the other thing is that the oceanography, so how the currents move around, is very important. And what happens in the West Indian Ocean is we have currents coming across from the Australian and Indonesian region. They come across the ocean towards the west and bring a lot of coral species. And then in the Mozambique Channel here, there are very complicated currents that set up very interesting dynamics that set up basically a center for diversity for coral reefs in this region. And the diversity here is very high. This is work from maybe 10 years ago, looking at the potential for world heritage in this region. And between the shallow marine habitats that we hear about a lot, I think we all know so well, the coral reefs, the mangroves and seagrasses are very well developed in this region. But then also the species diversity is very high. And then there are very different groups of species. So the coelacanth, this is an ancient fish. It's older than the dinosaurs, in fact. persisted on the East African coast because the coastline is so old, going so far back in time. The diversity of sharks and rays is really high and important here. And we have the whale sharks, for example, are a big attraction for people. And then a lot of work on turtles and seabirds and marine mammals as well in this region. So in our region, the science is not as well developed as say, off the California coast and the Pacific that you may hear a lot more about. But it is a very diverse region, and we're getting to know a lot more about it now as the science develops. So I've focused on coral specifically, on coral reefs, and these are, I think Rebecca and Luis have much prettier photos than I have. But the cool thing, or the interesting thing about the corals that we have here and the species that we have is, so this is a shot from 30 million years ago, showing the position. This is the African continent here. You can see Madagascar. You can see Australia is down off the edge of the picture. It's quite far away from Indonesia right now. You can see how India has been moving across the ocean, across this middle part of the ocean. And the effect that that has had is that this is what was called a Tethys Sea, going back 30, 50, 60 million years and before. And this was the highest diversity, or the center of diversity for corals and other shallow marine species back then. And so we had a lot of exposure, species coming from that region, where India really blocked off exposure or species coming across from the Indonesian region as well. And so the effect of that has been, and now that this gap has closed, India has bumped into Asia, and this middle part of the ocean is open. But we have a remnant group of species. I've shown some photos here. I'll show some closer up in the next few slides of some really ancient corals that today, most of the corals that you hear about, so these are the Acroporas or the staghorn and branching corals shown in this slide. The center of diversity for those corals is really the Indonesian region and Australia over here in the Coral Triangle. And they've diversified there in the last 5 to 10 million years, perhaps. But in the West Indian Ocean, we have all these species that have lineages going back maybe 30 million years or more to this ancient genetic stock in the Tethys Sea. And the interesting thing about these is that they're not very beautiful corals. They don't grow very fast. They're not the big reef builders that get all the attention, but they are these small brown corals, I call them. But they are basically monospecific genera. So these are genera of corals which only have one species in them because they don't diversify very much, and also the oceanography and the geology in the western part of the Indian Ocean is such that it doesn't promote the evolution of new species and diversification. So it's a very interesting region. We have these fairly unknown species of corals because very few people have studied them. We haven't done detailed studies in them yet. But this leads me on to the next thing that I'll talk about more, because without a lot of knowledge of some of these rare corals that are really remnants, ancient genetic remnants of past ages, there's so many threats affecting coral reefs now that we're beginning to lose species before we really get to know them very well. So all of these are small corals. They don't reproduce a lot, so they're found in small pockets. But this species, for example, Tenella chagius is the species name. It's named from the Chagos archipelago in the middle of the Indian Ocean. In the recent global bleaching events in the last 3 to 5 years, the populations of this species in Chagos have declined more than 95% from bleaching and mortality from global warming. And we're really not sure where the remnant populations of this species might be. So the big fear, of course, is that we lose it without getting to know much about it. And then these other genera, they're more common. They're quite common off the East African coast. But they're never super abundant. They're never dominant on a reef. They're always in the background. So an interesting group of corals to try and get to know more about in this part of the world. So that brings me to the pressures. And I come to this in coral reef talks because in the roles that I play now a lot, while I am a coral biologist, and I still do field work and and try and function as a scientist. There are so many pressures and so much is going wrong for coral reefs and other parts of nature that we really need to ramp up the efforts to reduce the pressures that are impacting coral reefs and other places. So this is just a selection of slides showing some images of decline. So in the middle here, you have a crown of thorns starfish, and these are predatory sea stars or starfish that eat corals. And they're known from the Great Barrier Reef and other places where they can multiply so that there are thousands or tens of thousands per hectare of reef area, and they decimate the corals completely. Rebecca mentioned coral bleaching, and this picture at the bottom is a combination of bleaching. That the tissue has turned clear so we can see the white skeleton. And there's a red disease that is beginning to impact that coral. And up in the top right over here, this is an image of some corals bleaching from temperature. There's pollution threats as well. This picture shows some bleaching of this coral over here under the dots, and these brown parts have already died back and being grown over by algae. And this is a combination of high temperatures and pollution as well that is affecting this reef. And what happens with that is that these old large colonies that Rebecca mentioned that may grow to hundreds of years of age and are really the corals that give the reefs their big structure, they do die back. And because they're so large, there might be some remnant pieces left. So in this one, what you can see is this large structure here is the original coral. It's probably about 3 meters across from left to right over here. Now, some patches have stayed alive. This patch over here is alive and is growing back. This patch as well, and there's a couple more. But you can see the integrity of that coral colony has been completely destroyed, and it's eroding back down on these lower parts, while other parts and other corals are starting to grow on it. So these challenges are a big problem for coral reefs around the world. And this leads to one of the main efforts that we're trying to do now in our region is really to consolidate information and knowledge around what's happening to coral reefs so that governments can take action. So cities as well and municipalities or companies also can invest in the reefs where they are and where they're invested to sustain them. So we have an entity called the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. I'll mention it again a little bit later on. And it's a global network that's been running for over 20 years now. And we've tried to pull together and re-energize our regional networks for updating the status of reefs in our region. So we did a report in 2017. There hadn't been one for quite some time. And the reason we did this was to really get a really good coherent understanding of the status of reefs. And what we found was worrying and concerning. And this is the same story is happening all around the world. So in the Western Indian Ocean or the Indian Ocean as a whole, we've had these large mass coral bleaching events where because of rising sea surface temperatures during the summer months, you get a mass mortality of corals. So we had a huge one in 1998. That was the first global event. And then we were also affected by the third event that Rebecca mentioned in 2016. And what these graphs try and show is that before 1998, the average cover of corals was about this level, 40%. So the bottom was covered by corals on a reef. And then after 1998, the overall coral cover decreased by about 25%. So we lost about a quarter of the coral cover. But it didn't really recover after that. So from 2000 all the way up to 2015, some reefs improved. You had recovery of corals after their mortality. But for other reefs that were facing other threats, they were declining, perhaps because of fishing or pollution or a local bleaching event. And on average, the coral cover stayed pretty much the same for about 15 years. Then in 2016, we had another major coral bleaching event, and the cover of corals declined again, now by about the same, about 20 to 25%. So now what we're wondering is what will happen in the next 5 to 10 years? Will it stay the same, just as happened in the last period? So is the average cover or the health of coral reefs declining in these steps each time we get one of these major global bleaching events? And what you see with the algae cover on the reef, so algae are the major competitors of corals, that jumped up after the 1998 event and stayed more or less stable, and then it jumped up again after the 2016 event. And are we slowly seeing a condition where the reefs are being taken over by algae, where they used to be coral? And of course, that's very important for the functioning of the reef, because algal reefs don't have the same diversity or productivity as coral reefs do. And then this graph is a bit more complicated to understand, but it shows the biomass or the weight of fish on our reefs from 2000 up to 2016. And what we've been seeing, this dark line here, is a decrease in the amount of predatory fish, of most of the fish groups. So fish are going down because of fishing impacts, really. And what we're seeing opposite to that is these are the herbivorous fish. They're actually increasing in biomass or abundance, which you think would be a good thing, but their sizes are getting smaller. But what we're a bit concerned about is that while we're still maintaining the herbivorous fish on the reef, is our reef turning from one where you're dominated by corals and have a wide diversity of fish to reefs where you are dominated by algae, and they'll be dominated by herbivorous fish that can eat that algae? So a simpler system. And is this undermining the long-term resilience of reefs in the regional scale? So the big concern is, what is the future for coral reefs if these threats just keep increasing? And there are really two main sources of threats. One is climate. That's very clear. The top graph shows the amount of warming, the temperature increase. So this is what it was up until sort of an index of temperature up till about 1980 over here. And then it's been increasing year on year after that, and decade on decade. Temperatures are going up. And then this is projected temperature over here. We're right around this dotted red line. So we're right where those two red and blue options diverge. And this is where Rebecca mentioned, either we do the best possible outcome and we implement the Paris Agreement and carbon dioxide emission reductions, and we get this blue line. So we stabilize warming below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. We'll still only have 10 to 30% of reefs still sort of fully functioning and diverse and unimpacted at that point. Even if we go to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the next best option, the percent of reefs surviving will go down to 1%. So that's one of the biggest threats. But the other is really a very general one from human population growth, both in countries, regional, but also global scales, and economic growth too. And this is a simple index showing how these sizes of the dots really show the size of, this is for Western Indian Ocean countries, the size of population in 2015, increasing out to 2030 and 2050 and out to 2100. So it goes up about 5 times. That's what this number says. Now we expect that income and economic activity will grow as well, as it should, because most of these countries are very poor and people do need higher incomes. They do need greater access to wealth to provide for their families. And that may grow up 3.5 times perhaps, or more likely. But there's also this factor here, and this is about technology and energy consumption. And that shows an increase as well. That's the way economies grow, by more energy intensification. And the problem is, if you multiply these small numbers, 5, 3.5, or 5 together, is what tells you the total impact of population and economic growth together. So you go from where we are now, there's a purple dot under here, to a dot that's 84 times higher because of the combined impacts from these. And what will be the fate of Western Indian Ocean reefs when they're facing almost 100 times more impacts than they're facing now? And we're already seeing huge declines. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do is to really get the message out, like in this forum, but also with government levels to really motivate for change in policy. So I'll just stop by mentioning a few of the areas that I'm focusing in to work on this, because there are many of us working on coral reefs around the world, and so restoration is a very important one that Rebecca's mentioned, and doing the research now so we have good techniques to restore reefs when we'll really need it in 20 to 30 or 40 years, in the Indo-Pacific will be very important. Restoration is very much in demand now in the Caribbean because it's much more vulnerable and has been much more impacted than the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. But we're going to need it soon too in these much larger ocean systems. So the first solution, I'll mention 4 quickly. One is this regional and global reporting through the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, because this helps to get countries working together at a regional context, a regional scale, so they don't undermine one another's efforts. And that's one very important thing. We're producing a global report, which will be due out later this year, the first in about 12 years. So we have a lot of hope for the impact of that report to help align efforts around the world. A second solution is to how to package information for decision-making and policymakers, is applying this red list of ecosystems approach. Now, this is an IUCN knowledge product or index. The red list of species is the one we all know about. But I think for coral reefs, the red list of ecosystems is much more impactful because it helps you to understand how close to collapse a reef ecosystem is. Now, and this, at the bottom right, this shows these words that we hear about from the red list of species as well: vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. So we try and get the same sort of information out for reefs. We've just applied this to the West Indian Ocean, and we are trying to get it published right now. So hopefully that result will be out in a few months. But I can't tell you all the results, but we basically found that at the whole regional scale, so looking at all these reefs, there's about 12,000 square kilometers in this region. All these reef systems are threatened with collapse in the next 50 years. We can predict that. About half of them due to climate change and warming, and that gives the greatest index of threat. But the other half is due to fishing impacts, so decline in fish populations and ecosystem collapse because of changing the ecology of the reefs. It's interesting to note, and this is a bit hopeful, I was surprised that the past climate impacts, so these 2 bleaching events we've already had, which were very big, they didn't come up as a major signal. The coral cover has been recovering with those, but what we are worried about is that the composition of species will have changed. And so we're losing the sensitive species and retaining only the more resistant ones. The third solution is the red list of species, and this is more familiar. This was done for the first time for corals in 2008. And in that, we found that 1/3 of reef-building corals faced a risk of extinction from climate change and local impacts. And so that's these yellow and orange and red up here. And the gray is the unknown species we don't know very well, but basically 1/3. So we're updating that right now with funding from the National Geographic Society and partners all around the world. We designed a system that is very amenable to the lockdowns we're having now because we had very little funding support for this. So we're going to do it all remotely. So it's one thing that the current situation of the COVID crisis hasn't actually slowed us down because we're already designing our work around not traveling and not seeing one another in workshops. And then the fourth thing is really one that is a very important. 2020 is a super year we thought it would be a super year for oceans and biodiversity and climate. It, of course, will still be that. It'll still be very important. But the priority has really been taken by the coronavirus crisis around the world, which is another sort of symptom of the collapse that is affecting coral reefs. But this year, the Convention on Biological Diversity is revising its next set of 10-year targets for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So coral reefs can play a major role in that because they're a great indicator system for the state of the planet. The Paris Agreement for climate is the other really important global agreement and need to get in place commitments this year to be working as soon as possible. And then for people, this IPBES is really, it's a global convention or body around ecosystem services and how people benefit from nature and sustainable development goals. There's really a global agenda for sustainability. And so we're working quite hard through publications such as this one here and through this new body called the Earth Commission to really identify concrete targets to help countries, companies, cities, and municipalities to really invest in sustainability. So I'll stop with that, but that's really the focus on coral reefs that we're having in East Africa right now. And I haven't mentioned a lot of local efforts, but I'll be happy to talk about that if there are any questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, David. That's extraordinary. Then the scope of the work is extraordinary as well. I wanted to ask one quick question. Well, we had quite a cluster of questions when you were talking about the most ancient lineages of coral reefs, because I think it's really extraordinary to think about reefs on that time scale. But what I will ask is that several people also were curious about, in your experience, the extent to which fisheries are or are not good partners in trying to protect reefs, considering how reliant they presumably are on healthy ones.
Oh, well, so fisheries are the essential partner in protecting reefs. So in most places so fisheries extract fish from a reef and they can really impact the reef system. So if you don't manage fisheries, you can destroy the ecology of the reef. Now, in most places, what's most important, it turns out, is that the communities who fish the reefs around them, or who are dependent on the same reefs year after year, are probably the best or amongst the best managers of coral reefs, because they have the greatest stake in maintaining the reef system for their future catch. The problem is where you have sort of fisheries where the fish are exported to a very distant market, where if you don't have fish in one place one year, they'll get the fish from another place, and they don't particularly care. So a lot of the effort in management now is working out that balance so fisheries management and biodiversity protection go hand in hand together, because they have to in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I will bring Louise to the stream now. Hi, Louise. And David, we'll see you at the end. Thank you so much again.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. Let me get your slides for you.
Thank you, Rebecca and David, for the great talks, great presentations. It's been great because now I don't have to talk a lot of the things that I usually start my presentations with, which are related to the impacts and conservation and hope for the future of coral reefs. So both Rebecca and David talked a lot about that. So I'm going to skip all that and go exactly to where I want to go today, which is still in coral reefs, but a little bit deeper. My work has been, I've worked on coral reefs through my whole life, starting in high school even. And my work has been moving lately, thanks to the support of the Academy and the infrastructure I have access to at the Academy. My work has been moving lately towards these deeper portions of the reef, which are called mesophotic coral ecosystems. And that's what I'm going to focus my talk on today. But they are an extension of the shallow reefs. And a lot of the problems that affect the shallow reefs are also affecting these deeper reefs. And in many ways, as I'll explain in a little bit, they're a lot harder to conserve, to preserve, to protect than shallow reefs are. So what do I mean by deep reefs or mesophotic coral reefs? They are, so the shallow coral reef, the portions that everybody knows about, all the pictures that David and Rebecca were showing, is basically restricted to the top 30 to 60 meters, so 100 to 200 feet of the coral reef. But the coral reefs, they extend beyond that. They go in some places, depending on how clear the water is, they go as far as 500 feet or 150 meters. So that portion between 100 to 200 feet, all the way to 500 feet, it remained and still remains unexplored, unknown, mostly because it's very hard to access, very hard to get there. So if you are a scientist and you want to study coral reefs, usually what you do is you go to a dive shop and you get an open water dive certification, and then you follow that up with several other trainings and you become a scientific diver. And then you study the coral reef using traditional scuba diving, which gives you access to that top 100 to 200 feet of the coral reefs. If you want to study reefs deeper than that, the only real options are either submarines, remote operated vehicles, ROVs, cameras, or technical scuba diving. And they all have their complications. The one that I use particularly is technical diving, because I study fish. And fish are a really hard group to study if you want to study them with remote operated vehicles or submarines, because fish swim away from things. Fish get scared. So if you go down to the deep reef with a submarine, which I did before, it takes much longer to get close to the fish with a submarine because of the noise and the lights and the size of the submarine. fish usually hide among the crevices. If you use an ROV, it's the same problem. With cameras, you can kind of get around that if you leave the camera on the bottom for a while, but then you have to have a bait. And then with the bait, you attract more of the predatory species than the other species. So the best way to study the entire community of deep reefs from a fish perspective is using technical scuba diving. And that takes a long time to learn. It's very risky. There's accidents relatively often, not as rarely as people think there are. So it's not an easy thing to do. Because of that, there's only very few people, maybe 2-3 labs in the world studying the reefs the same way I am, to the depths that I am studying with my group here at the Academy, which is all the way down to 150 meters. So when we started studying those deeper reefs, the first thing we did was try to understand or really figure out if they functioned as a refuge. So because they are inaccessible by scientists, a lot of people thought, so when you look at a deep reef from many perspectives, what you see is what's in that photo there. It's just blue water and nothing to see. Even if you put your face in the water, you have to go really deep to be able to see something. So because it's out of reach, both to scientists and to divers, there's very few recreational divers that dive to those depths either. There's not many photos of those deeper reefs. There's not many videos of those deeper reefs. People don't know where they are in general. So because they are inaccessible, a lot of people assumed that they were inaccessible to the impacts also, not only to people, but also to the impacts. A lot of people thought that there was less fishing on them, that those impacts that we're seeing on the shallow reefs that David and Rebecca explained so well, the climate change, the pollution, sedimentation, everything, those impacts, everybody thought they were restricted to the shallow reefs, and the deeper reefs were out of reach, let's put it that way. So that was one of the first things we tried to understand, is if those deep reefs are also impacted by those same factors. And we did that, as I said, by using technical scuba diving. That's Hudson Pinheiro and our postdocs here at the lab. And he's using a rebreather, which is the equipment we use. If you were more curious about that, you can go back into our Breakfast Club series. There's another talk that I specifically talk about this type of diving and go into a lot of details about that. There's another talk by Mauritius Bell, our dive safety officer, that also talks a lot about the use of rebreathers when diving. But we use them to do fish transects, to do community surveys, to look at impacts of those deep reefs throughout the world. That's Hudson doing a transect at about 135 meters depth, 140 meters depth in Ponape in Micronesia. At the time I took that photo, that was the deepest transect, the deepest fish transect done by a diver anywhere in the world. Since then, we've done some deeper transects than that, but it's a very, very complicated operation, and we have this data from several places trying to figure out how the communities organize themselves at those depths and how similar they are to shallow fish communities. And one of the first things we noted as we started doing this work is that there's a lot, I can't stress that enough, a lot of species or things we don't know about those deep reefs, starting with new species. Those species in this slide there are all species that we discovered that were brand new to science. They had no names whatsoever. We had to come up with their names. And we discovered them over the past 5 years since we started this project. The three on the top left there, the two Plectranthus and the one Chromis, their publications came out in the last 2 or 3 months. So this is ongoing work. There's still a lot more that are not in that photo that still don't have names, that we're still working on putting names on them, doing all of the taxonomic work to describe the species, to avoid exactly what they've referred to, which is losing those species even before we know them. The two more recent ones are this one. This is Plectranthus. Now I can actually share the name because we published this. This description came out about 2 weeks ago. This is Plectranthus polygonius from French Polynesia and the Marshall Islands. And this one is Plectranthus hinano from French Polynesia. Both of them we just described about 2 weeks ago, the paper came out. So there's still a lot of work ongoing, still a lot of descriptions we're doing. And the other thing I want to stress here is that those are fish. Those are the most mobile, the most conspicuous inhabitants of those habitats. If we start looking at smaller organisms like tiny little shrimp, crustaceans, tiny little mollusks, sponges, the more cryptic, the stuff that hides more, the number of new species on those taxa, it's going to be gigantic compared to what we're finding in fish. Now, when we did all of those transects, we accumulate data from all over the world. The first thing we saw was that those deeper reef communities were very different from shallow reef communities. So the numbers you're seeing that, I don't know if you can read that, it's really small on my screen, but the numbers you're seeing there are differences between shallow and deep communities. And those are the depth strata there. So 30 meters, 60 meters, and 90 meters. So the shallow community differs by anywhere between 87 to 96% from the upper mesophotic, from the shallower portion of those deeper reefs. And the deeper you go, the more different they are. So the communities of those deeper reefs are very, very different from the communities of the shallow reefs. And then the second thing we tried to figure out, we tried to understand, was exactly what kind of impacts those deeper reefs were subject to. Pass the slide here. So this is a dive we did in the Bahamas right after a hurricane had passed. So it was like a day or two after a massive hurricane passed through the Bahamas. And there was some work prior to us doing this dive that indicated that those deeper reefs, they were kind of sheltered from the impacts of hurricanes. So when a hurricane passes by, it breaks a lot of the corals from the shallow water because it generates so many waves, and it steers up all the sand from the bottom and covers the coral with the living coral. It buries them with sand. And a lot of people thought that because hurricanes are a surface phenomenon, a lot of people thought that those impacts were restricted to the shallow reefs, because the deeper you go, the less impacts there are, allegedly, or so people thought. But when we dove, this picture I took at about 130 meters depth, that's about 430, 440 feet depth. And the slope of the reef at that particular location is not supposed to be white like that. The reason why it's white is because all of the sand from the shallow reef was steered up by the turbulence caused by the hurricane, and then it cascaded down and covered the corals. It basically buried the corals alive from the deeper reefs. And there's indications that these kind of impact or sedimentation caused both by hurricanes, but also by humans. There's a lot of places where people, for example, remove all of the tree cover from the coastal forests in several areas. So if you remove the trees, when it rains, all of the sediment that the trees held up with their roots, it gets washed up into the ocean. And as it gets washed up into the ocean, it sinks to the bottom along the slopes, and then it buries the deep reefs with it. So sedimentation is a big, big problem to deep reefs. Here are a few examples. The one on the top left there is actually bleaching. So there was something else that people didn't think that really affected deeper corals was bleaching, because the temperatures are lower the deeper you go in the ocean, and they are lower in those deeper reefs. But the problem is they're lower, but they're also rising. So the problem that corals have with temperature is not the absolute temperature number, is how much it departs from the average temperature they're used to. So the shallow corals, they're used to a certain average temperature that's slightly high already. If it rises above what they're used to, they bleach. It's the same with the deep corals. They're used to a certain average temperature. The average temperature they're used to is lower than the average temperature that the shallow corals are used to. But that average temperature for the deep corals, it's also rising. So when that rises, it also causes the deep ones to bleach. The other photos there, they show just corals that were buried by that sediment load that came up from the shallows when when the hurricane passed, or in some cases, just sedimentation that rains from the shallows towards the deep and buries those deeper corals when it comes down. This is a picture I took at the Philippines at about 140, 145 meters depth. That's a sea urchin that uses things that are around it to camouflage itself with. So if it's in a seagrass bed, it kind of grabs pieces of seagrass that are around and attaches them to itself to camouflage itself. So here in the deep portion of the ocean that nobody, I can tell you with 100% certainty that our team was the first team to ever dive that deep on that particular reef. This sea urchin grabbed a piece of plastic. That blue thing there is a piece of plastic that was lying on the bottom to camouflage itself with, and it's hanging onto a fishing line. And that's on a reef that we were the very first humans to see. The fishing lines in some areas, in reefs, in mesophotic reefs and deeper reefs that are close to fishing villages or to cities or to human populated areas, those deep reefs, they have so many fishing lines tangled to it that it becomes a hazard for us to dive in them. We're always looking behind us to see if we're not getting tangled in any of those fishing lines, which is a big problem if you do at 400, 500 feet. Another huge problem that we see is lines from anchors. So the left side of that photo there is a boat that tried to anchor on that particular site. And when it was ready to leave the area, they couldn't pull the anchor up, so they just cut the line and left the anchor with the line down there. And that became trash. That became something. One of the places where we saw some of the biggest impacts was in Guam. And Guam was really interesting because it's one of the most impacted coral reefs in the world. Oh, I'm back. Everybody eats fish there, so the shallow reefs are very highly impacted. And what we saw in the deep reefs was a stark comparison to what we saw in the shallow reefs. So those photos up there are what we saw in the deep reefs. It was a relatively healthy deep reef, although we saw a lot of indication that there was a lot of fishing going on. So there was a lot of broken fishing lines, a lot of broken anchor lines, a lot of physical damage to the reef. And there was a general lack of big predators on the reef. But when you move shallow, what was really stunning about Guam was that almost all of the shallow reefs we saw were almost entirely dead. And what that told us was just, it made us think like 10 times over that really that refuge idea that people thought that the deep reefs were a refuge that would somehow save the shallow reefs is really not the case, because we see here a relatively healthy deep reef in a completely dead shallow reef, and there's nothing moving between the deep and the shallow reef because it's a completely different community that is already impacted, and it's also under its own or suffering with its own threats, its own impacts. So one of the things that we're really focusing on doing right now is trying to raise awareness, trying to tell people that those reefs even exist. A lot of people don't even know that reefs extend beyond the depth where a normal scuba diver can dive on. So this is one of the ways we're doing it. This is a fish that we described recently from Zanzibar, from Tanzania. And we had a little bit of fun with taxonomy there, but the fun that we had generated a lot of visibility for this fish outside of the scientific community and outside of the outside of the biology community through the wider public. We named it Cirrhilabris wakanda in honor of the mythical Wakanda nation of Black Panther. And it got a lot of attention from the media, including like CNN and others. So we were able to tell the story not only of this fish, but also of its habitat in the media with a simple, describing a species. After you figure out the species is new, it's a relatively simple scientific thing to do. You just basically only describe the species. So it kind of becomes, most of the time, it becomes an uninteresting scientific description. And yes, it's like the most basic thing you can do. It's one of the most important things you can do, because you give a name to that species. But in addition to that, we wanted to go a step further and make this as widely available to the public as possible. So we're trying to come up with these interesting names so that it gets more attention than just the scientific name. Something else we're doing, and I encourage everybody to do whenever, if you're local in California, whenever we start reopening after this whole pandemic thing goes away, is come to the Academy to check out our Twilight Zone exhibit. So we have a whole exhibit at the Academy dedicated to those deep reefs and their inhabitants. We have even a tank there that we keep only species that are new to science. So most of the species that we show in this exhibit are not shown anywhere else in the world, and not even in private aquaria, or people that are like really aficionado with aquaria and go to extreme lengths to get really rare fish. Not even them have access to that, because we're one of the few teams that can go down and actually collect those species. So what we kind of try to do, like closing the loop here with all of this work, is to raise awareness that those deep reef exists, and to try to include them in protection and conservation schemes throughout the world. So a common thing that we're seeing everywhere we go is that most marine protected areas, they only extend to the reefs, to the depths where people dive. So in the Philippines is a great example. Brazil is another example. There's several marine protected areas there that stop right at about 150 feet depth. So that's 40, 50 meters depth. They stop, and then nothing beyond that is protected. All of the deep reef is unprotected. And it's exactly because people don't know it's there, people don't know what is there, and people don't know that those reefs are also impacted. So we hope that through this work, we raise awareness, and we kind of convince governments that to change policy and include deep reefs in their protection schemes. And that was my last slide. So with that, I wanted to open for discussion.
Thank you so much, Luis. And we should probably just get this out of the way, because we get this every time for you. Molly would like to know, what's the deepest you've ever dove?
We have a thing that we say every time we dive, and every time somebody asks us that question, is that we chase fish, not numbers. So I do
totally know the number.
I do know the number, because we have to log that. So we officially have to log every single dive through our dive safety office to keep track of all of that. And for the longest time, I think for more than a year, on purpose, I kept looking at my computer gauge when I was really deep, and trying not to pass 149 meters, because I didn't want to say that I went to 150 meters just to say that I went to 150 meters. And then once chasing a fish, I finally passed it. But it was entirely by accident. It was not because I chased the number. So my deepest dive is 153 meters, because I was chasing that fish. That's about 505 feet, I think.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. I'm going to bring back our other two panelists. David is not, is he showing up for you too?
No.
Oh, okay. So, okay. Well, we'll give him a second. It may just be it is just a Wi-Fi thing, I'm sure, because he's still connected. But yes, thank you again. We got some really, really good questions here. And sorry, I'm just having David, can you hear? Okay, he's popped off, but he'll be back in a moment. So we got some really good questions. I was going to start with this one from Alexa, who asked, oops, I've heard the noise of David coming back. Let me grab him quickly. Yay, hello. Also, David, I meant to thank you, because I'm always so thrilled whenever a coelacanth makes an appearance on this show.
It's my pipe dream, is to see one. When I see one diving by accident, not where you are, David, not in the expected areas. If I see one in like the Maldives or Indonesia or the Philippines that I'm not expecting to see, I'm retiring.
Okay, so our first question, and this one is from Alexa. She writes, since COVID, I've read a lot of articles saying shutdowns have given animals and oceans a break in some places. Is that true, or meaningful at all? And anyone can take that.
Okay, well, I'll take a shot at that. Well, it's certainly true. I mean, and so we work with fishing communities here in Kenya and East Africa a lot, and many fishermen can't go and fish for a number of reasons. One, they may not be able to travel to their fishing sites, on public transport, or else the markets are not open. So even if they catch fish, they may not have anywhere to go to sell it. So it's certainly true that the COVID has given nature a break in many ways. But the flip side of that is that a lot of the conservation funding here is based on tourism. And without tourism as an income stream in local communities, a lot of people will go hungry, and they may be forced to fish or hunt more to eat. And so I think the short-term impact is probably good for nature, but the medium-term, the 2 to 3 year impact, could be terrible for nature, because all of the ways in which we've been supporting conservation over the last few years fall to pieces. And what happens until we can really set them up again in 3 or 4 years' time?
Yeah. I'll also just add that you may have seen in the media that there's been a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions during COVID because people haven't been traveling as much, not driving as much, not flying as much. And so that, to some extent, has eased some of the greenhouse gas emissions and pressure, but it's over a very short time scale. And so if that were something that were sustained or actually fed back into us making meaningful changes to shifting towards more sustainable uses of energy, that would over the long term ease pressure on reefs. But in terms of actually having a meaningful climate change mitigation on reef pressure over the course of these months, the time scale is not long enough to actually ease temperatures or pressure over that phase.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the parallel that I've seen for fisheries that some people are tracing is that with World War II. So at World War II, there was a long pause in fisheries, but that was like for 4 or 5 years. And that during that time, a lot of fishery stocks, they did recover, which resulted in a lot of higher catches right after following World War II. But that lasted for as much as 5 years in some places. And then we went right back to overfishing after that. So it's a nice thing in the short term, but as David said, in the long term or medium term, it might be very damaging because it's affecting several different industries in several different ways.
Yeah, okay. So this relates to 2 other questions that we got that feed in nicely. One was just in general about the people who are really curious about whether tourism in general is a positive or detrimental force in terms of coral reef health. And I imagine that you have examples of both, but in general, how would you kind of respond to that?
I think in many, again, in East African countries, I mean, tourism is one of the biggest public foreign exchange earners in national economies, and also providing jobs at the local level. So in restaurants and hotels, but also tourist guides, nature guides, going snorkeling. So tourism is an industry with incredible reach. And in fact, when you look at the numbers, it's a much bigger industry in dollar terms than fishing is even. So it's really one of the biggest industries that really is puts a value on nature, and that's very important for people to invest in sustaining those natural assets that tourism is dependent on. But it has to be done the right way, and there are many damaging ways to do tourism, and there are many good ways to do tourism.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, in the Philippines and in Indonesia, most actually of the marine reserves are directly sustained by tourism. And I have no idea what's going to happen there because there's a lot. So the way they create those small marine protected areas, again, the ones that don't include the deeper reefs in the Philippines and in Indonesia especially, and I haven't seen this done anywhere else actually, or in a few other places. In Brazil, it's like that too. They maintain the reserve financially by charging tourists to visit the marine reserves. And all of that income goes to paying the fishermen that used to fish in those areas to, instead of fishing, taking care of the marine protected area. So doing the monitoring and the enforcement So the fishermen that used to fish there, now they get a salary from the income from the tourists. So tourists pay to get into the reserves. And it's funny, in a lot of places, in Philippines, for example, they charge, I don't know, a certain dollar amount for if you're a diver, and then more if you're taking underwater pictures, and then more if you're filming, which I absolutely don't mind. I think it has to be done because they have to sustain their livelihood somehow. But then all of that now is removed because there's no tourists coming in.
Yeah. Okay. And another question we got that was this is related to the break that Alexa mentioned, but several other people asked, and I think this question or these comments initially came when Rebecca was talking about. Let me just find one of them so I can. So when Rebecca, when you referenced meaningful breathing room, people were really curious what that actually would translate into, like how many years it would take to add up to meaningful breathing room. But it sounds also like what you all just said previously was that, there's the question of breathing room, but then also it's like what happens immediately after that. So I didn't frame that particularly well, but what does meaningful breathing room look like, and what would it take to sustain that afterwards?
Well, so just referencing this particular statistic that I said, we think on average it takes a reef around 10 to 20 years to recover from an acute disturbance like a bleaching event. And so, bleaching is something that has happened. It's a stress response, and it can happen in response to anything. So it's not something that just started happening. It's happened as long as reefs have been around, but we just don't want to see it happening at the frequency that it is happening right now. So if you were to ease climate change pressure on reefs so that they weren't at their peak thermal threshold and bleaching every 5 years, every 6 years, if you had a bleaching event like we might have historically once every 30 years, then there's meaningful time for that reef to come back, and there's quite a lot of research both in forestry and in coral reefs looking at kind of like what we call an intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that kind of having those disturbances at a certain level of frequency, like say every 30 to 40 years, can help actually boost diversity, because you kind of mix things up a little bit and provide opportunities for more species to come in. And it takes a stable system and kind of shakes it up and provides opportunities. So I don't know that there's an exact number, but I would say, we don't want to see the scale of frequency or of disturbance that's happening right now. We can't have that happening anywhere more frequent than every 15, 20 years and have any sort of meaningful stability in that system. I'm sure that David might have things to add to that.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that, what Rebecca said is exactly right, is that ecosystems need, 10, 15, 20 years to really rebuild after major impacts. And of course, that's not even enough time for the really long-lived individuals to go back. But I think the key thing that we need to learn from this COVID experience is that we don't want to just have a breathing room and then get back to where we are now. For many systems like coral reefs, we are already above the limit for sustainability. So in this build back better period, we need to rebuild an economic system and a system of dealing with pollution impact, so we don't get back to the same place. We get to a place of equal benefits to people and quality of life, but without the same impacts to the environment.
Okay.
Right. And an example I use sometimes in a lot of my presentations is Bikini Atoll, to say that if you give them space and if you give them time, they do recover, and they do recover very nicely and very effectively. Bikini Atoll, I don't know if there's anybody out there that doesn't know, but it's an island in the Marshall Islands that was used as a testing site for nuclear tests by the US for a long time, between after the World War II and all the way to the late 50s. There were dozens of nuclear bombs that were detonated in the island, including the largest ever atomic nuclear detonation ever done by humans. I don't know how many, hundreds of times bigger than Hiroshima. But they wiped out all the corals from the island basically with those nuclear tests. And I went there about 15 years ago, and I saw one of the best coral reefs I've ever seen in the Pacific, because after they ended the test in the late 1950s, the island was off limits for everything, including fishing. There was nobody living in the island, so they left it alone for 50 years. 50 years later, I went back there, and it was completely restored as far as I could tell.
Yeah. So that kind of leads a bit. So Missy is really curious about what the healthiest coral reef that all of you have seen, or that you would consider, what reef you would consider the healthiest. But perhaps that also connects to James's question, which is whether there are any countries or governments that come to mind for each of you in terms of doing a really outstanding job at protecting their reefs.
Who's gonna take that one first?
You could just always go alphabetical if it helps.
Thanks, Bill. Right now, the healthiest, I started diving on the Great Barrier Reef back in the early 2000s, the late 90s. And at that time, it had already, there's this idea of shifting baselines, and it had already degraded, I'm sure. But at that time, there were reefs out near the Coral Sea that were just incredible, like I've never seen before. I will also say, and that's kind of in the more of the traditional, like iconic, what you think of when you think of a shallow coral reef, these tropical shallow coral reefs, like teeming with biodiversity and life. But I will say that the last few years, a lot of the places that I've gone have challenged my own thinking of what a healthy coral reef is. And so I've seen a lot of reefs in remote locations in Palau and in the Philippines that have really incredible amounts of species diversity in what we don't necessarily think of as one of these crystal clear water, like beautiful shallow locations. So I have seen some really beautiful high diversity reefs in areas of the Philippines and Palau as well. In terms of countries that really protect their coral reefs well, I think all countries right now could probably do better in terms of marine protected areas and in terms of mitigating local impacts, particularly sedimentation, runoff, and nutrient and overfishing impacts on reefs. There are certainly certain countries that do a better job, like Luis was saying, in terms of policing the tourism impact on reefs. So they will make you pay a fee before you dive on a reef. Some countries actually make you demonstrate a buoyancy test so that you're not going to actually damage the reef when you're physically in the water. And so those types of things definitely help. But in terms of, I'm gonna punt to Luis and David in terms of reefs, countries that are setting the bar right now.
Yeah, I think if I take that one first, for setting the bar on reef protection, it's very challenging, but it's really, I think, the small island states, so the Pacific states and a couple in the Indian Ocean, I think, are really probably doing the best job. And I think for two reasons. One is there are many island systems and reefs are quite remote, and there's so low levels of pressure compared to large continental countries. And the second thing is that often their cultures are very much in tune with the reef and the ocean systems in ways that continental peoples just are not, because continental people have a huge continent and the sea is just something that happens, beyond the shoreline. So I think, Palau, Kiribati have worked in a bit, and other countries, Fiji and others, I think they have the best holistic systems. But of course, there are a lot of local challenges in governance, implementation, and funding in many places. And then I think for reefs that are still in the best condition, I was working in the Phoenix Islands in the middle of the Pacific, and I've been to the Southern Line Islands as well. One of the questions in the chat mentioned that as being in very good condition. Yes, there are individual islands that have been, but they're all vulnerable to climate change. That's the thing. And I think it's really only in some of the really complex reef systems in the Coral Triangle region, so Indonesia, the Philippines, and those areas where you have areas of reef that are probably still in the best shape, but they are, surrounded by a sea of impacts in other places. And it's a very complex dynamic. So it's very hard to say where is best and where will fare best in coming years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree with the small island nation in the Maldives in the Indian Ocean is another really good example, but also a good example that almost entirely depends on tourism. So they're shifting their extractive kind of activities into converting more and more of their outer islands into resorts and hotels and things like that for tourism, which is a relatively lower impact for the reef than just going out and fishing and in an unsustainable way, which in some places was the case. But again, when you lose the income from the tourism, then what do you do, right? Australia would be a great example for large-scale protection if it wasn't for the recent shift in policy towards burning everything they have and not caring about climate change anymore. But the Great Barrier Reef, until, I don't know, 10 years ago, was the shining example of one of the best protected dead zone nation that they have. Is something, it's beautiful. The country actually has the resources to monitor and enforce that area, which is one of my points of criticism for a lot of other countries out there creating those huge marine protected areas with absolutely no resources to monitor or enforce them. But that's not the case for Australia. They have the means to actually enforce a protected area the size of the Great Barrier Reef. But their national policies now are to burn. So they are shooting themselves on the foot, because it doesn't matter how much you protect the reef locally. If the temperatures are rising and everything is bleaching, they're gonna go away anyways.
Yeah, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is one of the longest standing marine park systems in the world. And it's like Luis said, really well managed. And back in, I believe it was 2005, they actually they kind of set the precedent of increasing the percent that was protected, I think from 5% to almost 35%. So they really kind of set the bar in terms of establishing and implementing.
She froze.
Yeah, I usually give them 10 seconds.
Oh, you're back.
We can hear you, Rebecca.
We lost you in the last sentence there.
Oh, I just said that, like Luis said, policy coherence is the real challenge right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I will ask you all two more. There's obviously a lot of questions that we're not going to get to today. So, excuse me. So we'll try to loop back and answer those after the fact. But Emily asked, what specific actions can individuals take to help protect reefs beyond just choosing sustainable seafood and trying to do our part for climate change? Where should I be writing? Who should she be writing to, or where should she be contributing to help directly? I think is her question. I know that's a big one, but it's a nice one to semi-wrap up with.
Yeah, I think in the US, it's a lot to do with voting. Amazingly, the US has in its territories and even in the continental waters, the US has a lot of coral reef, and a lot of those are not protected, and even the ones that are protected are suffering with climate change. So voting in a way that will bring more protection both at a global and a local scale to those reefs is a really good first step. Talking about it to your friends and just challenging. There's a lot of people that are fearful of confrontation and don't challenge the position of friends when they say, oh, there's no such thing as global warming. You're like, look, the reefs are dying. It's not a matter of opinion here, it's a matter of fact. So there's quite a few things you can do. I know it's challenging because it's such a big problem at a global scale, but I think if we get together, we can do it. We can solve it.
The talking about it thing is interesting, because like David's point about how for people on big continents, the reefs are not that real. They are kind of something that you maybe visit occasionally, but unless the people on those really big continents actually start caring in a way that is comparable to people on tiny islands who are impacted immediately, it's not going to shift. So talking about it sounds great, yet making it real, making it urgent, even if you don't see it every day out your window. Yeah.
Yeah,
Rebecca and David.
one thing I say, or to motivate for action, because what does each individual do is a very real question. So even if you're not at a coral reef place, if the things that you do are such that they help coral reefs, so carbon emission reductions and energy saving practices, consumption practices, reducing pollution, plastic pollution, other types of pollution, those are all good for reefs, and they're all good for other things too. So, reefs are really quite a canary in the coal mine, or a flagship for the state of the planet. So the thing is, say if we can save the reefs, we save everything else, because they are really that first global ecosystem that is tipping over the edge. So you can do a lot where you are, if not directly for the reefs, but for other systems and then the political systems change as well, and the value systems change to also generate the kind of change that we need.
Great. Okay, shall I ask the last one or anything else on that question? Okay.
I would just reiterate everything that was already said.
You're just going to ditto? Yeah, fair. Okay, so we'll end with this one from Veronica. That is in the vein of David wearing a Hawaiian shirt because of Harry's bad news.
And mine is Hawaiian too.
Okay, sorry.
It's just not as flashy.
She'd like to know, what are you each most encouraged by?
That's a great question. I can go first. I think that this was a really hard question for me to answer a few years ago, and it's becoming easier to answer. And for me, we're not there yet. I don't think that, the solutions that I talked about in my talk as well are not things that are going to save coral reefs. They are, I think the thing that's the most inspiring to me right now is the shift in thinking to a more creative, innovative, interdisciplinary, out of the box style of thinking that might be able to address some things and buy time. And so it's a type of innovative thinking and interdisciplinary work that I haven't, I've been in this field maybe 20 years and I haven't sensed that previously. And so I'm finding that really inspiring over the last couple of years. And again, I don't think we're there yet, but I think the direction that the thought process is moving is very hopeful to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess if I'll pick up from what Rebecca just said, but in a more, I suppose, personal, cultural way, and the sort of transformations that we need. I think a crisis like the current crisis, the COVID crisis, and also in the US, the Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's really showing how there are people who are, communities come together. People come together when faced with a really big problem, and the sorts of changes that we need, the out-of-the-box thinking or the transformational change that is needed, really does need people to want to do different, and then to work out how to do that, see an example from somewhere else or through a friend or through a colleague, or you just hear something from somewhere else, and to change practices. And that is possible is the thing that gives me the most optimism, because all the standard things that we do don't quite get there. We really need to get to that big personal and cultural changes to make a difference now.
Right. My go-to example is the one I already talked about, the Bikini Atoll recovery, which came back to a flourishing reef after being bombed completely out of existence. But I have another one too. I mean, if you follow me on social media, or if you've seen any of my other talks, I have a lot of underwater photography that I take on these reefs, because I find them, like, to me, they're awe-inspiring in whichever way I can think of. And whenever I share that content with people, I see their attitudes change. I see their behavior change. And I don't believe that anybody, when they see that, when they're confronted with what is actually happening, everybody's capable of changing their minds and their opinions. So that's, I think, one of the things that gives me the most hope.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. This was a really powerful way to end. And I will go ahead and drop the links to everybody's Twitter handles and websites into the comments section as soon as we're done. So please follow our speakers, follow their work. And if you'd like to hear more about ocean exploration, come back on Wednesday when we're going to be talking about some of the technology that drives that today. But thank you so much for watching, and please join us again soon. And I'll go ahead and say goodbye now. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. A pleasure.
Thanks.